Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. I remember when my wife and I first moved out here to our cabin. The place felt untouched and quiet, a world away from the noise and mess of the city. We'd chosen this deep forest spot for a simple life, far from people. For over 20 years, we called this place home. Our days were peaceful, with trees all around and the sounds of birds and wind. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. But lately, things started to feel wrong. It was small stuff at first, little things that were easy to brush off. Some nights, I'd step outside to check the generator and find small piles of stones arranged on the front steps. At first, I figured it was animals, maybe raccoons or something else poking around. But the stone piles began to look strange, almost like signs or symbols. My wife noticed it too, but we didn't talk about it much, figuring it was just one of the forest's oddities. Then we started hearing sounds that didn't belong. Sometimes it was a deep rumble, other times sharp snaps echoing through the trees. We knew the usual noises out here: owls, coyotes, branches swaying in the wind. But these sounds were different. They were close and felt intentional, put us on edge. Most nights, I'd find myself lying awake, listening for anything out of the ordinary. But by sunrise, everything would be calm, like nothing ever happened. One night, I woke up to the faintest noise outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, moving around the cabin. I lay there, listening for a long time, telling myself it was just some animal, maybe a bear or a large dog sniffing around. But I didn't move, and neither did my wife. We both lay there, barely breathing, listening to that slow, unsettling movement circling us. In the morning, we found deep scratches on the walls of the cabin, low and uneven, like something had tried to get inside. The marks were rough and powerful. It made my skin crawl just looking at them. But we told ourselves it was probably a bear or a stray dog. I tried to act calm, but I could see the worry creeping into my wife's face. A few quiet days passed, and we almost managed to push it from our minds, until we found a dead deer lying just 50 yards from the cabin. It was torn open, but not in a way you'd expect from a predator. It looked like someone had just hacked at it, without any plan or purpose. There were no tracks, no signs of a fight, just the deer, left alone in the middle of the clearing. That night, as the sun went down, I made sure all the doors and windows were tightly locked. The air was thick with silence, heavier than usual. Around midnight, a loud bang hit the side of the cabin, hard enough to make the walls shake. We both froze, holding our breaths. Another bang followed, then another, moving along the walls, almost like something was testing the place, looking for a weak spot. The noise stopped, leaving an awful silence, and for a moment, I let myself believe it was over. But then we heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps, as if someone was dragging their feet. They moved around in a circle, first along the front, then around the side, finally stopping right outside our bedroom window. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting as the silence stretched on. And then, a soft scratching began at the window, slow and steady. It sounded like nails scraping against glass. I couldn't see what was causing it, but I didn't need to. I just knew something or someone was standing just inches away, separated only by that thin sheet of glass. The scratching went on for what felt like hours, and then, without a sound, the footsteps faded back into the woods. By morning, there were no tracks, no signs that anyone had been there, just those scratches on the window, and that awful feeling, like something was watching us, waiting for the right time. We lasted one more night before deciding to leave. As we packed up, I looked back at the cabin one last time, feeling like I was leaving part of myself behind. I thought we could live out here, that we could stay in peace. But something out there didn't want us here anymore. It felt like the forest itself had turned against us, like we'd crossed some line we weren't supposed to. I don't know what was out there, but I know it's still there, watching, hidden among the trees. And I can't shake the feeling that one day it'll come looking for us again. Because maybe it isn't just the forest. Maybe it's waiting for us, hiding in the shadows, ready for the moment we let our guard down. I was looking forward to a weekend alone in the woods, hoping for some peace from the noise of the city. I'd rented a small, cheap cabin deep in the forest, far from anything else. The owner had said it was basic but quiet, and that was all I wanted. By the time I got there, a heavy rain had already started, making the ground muddy and slick, and the forest around me seemed darker than usual, almost weighed down by the rain. The cabin was barely more than a single room with an old bed, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove. It smelled of wet wood, and the air inside felt damp and stale. The only light was a dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering whenever I turned it on. I dropped my things down, glad to be out of the rain. The sound of the storm was so loud against the metal roof that I could barely hear anything else. I tried to settle in, unpacked my stuff, and made a simple meal. Outside, the rain only came down harder, with thunder rumbling in the distance. The darkness felt like it was pressing up against the windows. I found myself looking outside now and then, expecting to see something, though I didn't know what. I figured it was just nerves. But even though I tried to relax, I kept hearing odd little sounds outside, faint and half covered by the storm. Hours went by, and the storm kept going strong. When I finally lay down to sleep, I found it nearly impossible to rest. Every creak from the old wood, every branch snapping outside in the wind, made my heart race. I lay there, trying to ignore the growing feeling that I wasn't alone out here. But the longer I stayed in the dark, the stronger that feeling got. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, right near the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The sound faded after a few minutes, and I tried to tell myself it was just a branch or some animal. Eventually, I started to drift off, only to be jolted awake by a loud banging on the back wall of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I sat up in bed, clutching the blankets tight. This wasn't the wind. It was a steady, heavy banging, like someone pounding with a fist. It happened once, then again, then again. I froze, barely able to breathe, as it continued, slowly moving along the wall, coming closer to the window. I wanted to believe it was a branch or an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The pattern was too steady, too controlled. I grabbed my flashlight but quickly turned it off, not wanting to give myself away. I crawled out of bed and sat there, my back pressed to the wall, as the banging continued. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. After a while, the banging stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the rain. But instead of feeling relieved, the quiet somehow made it worse. I sat in the dark, staring at the door, scared it would open any second. Just as I was thinking about making a run for it, I heard a noise near the window. It was slow, heavy breathing, right outside the glass. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound continued, close to the glass, deep and steady, like someone standing just inches away, watching. I didn't dare look, too afraid of what I might see. Minutes went by, each second feeling longer than the last. Finally, the breathing stopped, but I stayed where I was, pressed against the wall, waiting for any sign that whoever was out there had gone. Hours passed, and I stayed awake, listening, until the first light of dawn. When the rain finally stopped, I gathered the courage to peek out the window. The ground outside was covered in fresh, deep footprints, clearly human footprints, leading from the trees up to the cabin, stopping at the windows, circling around to the door and back again. They were too big to be mine, and they looked fresh, pressed into the muddy ground from the night before. I didn't waste any time. I left the cabin as quickly as I could, not even bothering to pack. I just wanted to get back to the road, back to my car, back to anywhere but that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there watching me that night, but I knew it wasn't just some animal. The thought that haunted me most as I drove away, though, was something I'd almost missed. The footprints hadn't started at the edge of the forest, like someone had just walked up in the rain. They had started at the cabin, right by the door, like someone or something had already been there, waiting in the storm long before I arrived. We'd been married for over 40 years, and my husband, a retired sergeant, had always loved being outdoors. Even at 71, he was still determined and strong, even though his body had started to slow down a bit. He was set on taking me out to this old cabin in the woods, one of his favorite spots from when he used to train nearby. He said it would be peaceful, good for us, maybe one last adventure together. The cabin was old and worn, creaking with every step we took inside. Dust covered the shelves and counters, and the small windows only let in a thin line of dim light. As night settled, the forest around us seemed to close in, and I felt a strange unease, like someone was watching us. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the quiet and the isolation. Our first night passed without any issues, though I didn't sleep well. My husband was up early the next morning, setting up a fire and walking down to the nearby stream to get water. I stayed behind, tidying up the cabin and organizing the things we'd brought. By late afternoon, he still hadn't come back. I figured he'd taken a long walk along one of his old trails, maybe getting lost in memories from his younger days. But as evening came and he still wasn't back, I started to feel a growing worry. He'd always been so reliable, so sure of himself. It wasn't like him to just disappear. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, calling his name and listening to my own voice echo and fade into the trees. Only the rustle of leaves answered me. Hours passed. The night was pitch black, and I was alone, straining to catch any sign of him. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to get lost myself. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something. A branch breaking, footsteps crunching in the underbrush. But each time I shone my light around, I saw only shadows. I must have drifted off at some point, sitting on the porch, because when I opened my eyes, the sky was turning a soft gray with dawn. And that's when I saw him standing just at the edge of the clearing, near the trees. A rush of relief hit me, but it quickly faded. Something was wrong. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his back to me. His shoulders were slouched, and he looked smaller, somehow, fragile in a way I'd never seen him before. I walked toward him, feeling a cold dread growing in my chest. As I got closer, I saw his clothes were torn and dirty, like he'd been fighting his way through the brush all night. Scratches covered his face and arms. I called his name softly, but he didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I walked up slowly and touched his shoulder gently. He finally moved then, turning to look at me, and I saw a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. A blank, empty stare, like he wasn't really seeing me. His hands were scraped and raw, clutching a handful of dirt and small stones. I tried to lead him back to the cabin, but he resisted at first, his eyes locked on the woods, like something was calling him back. He eventually followed, but he walked slowly, turning his head back every few steps, that vacant look never leaving his face. We got back inside, and I helped him sit down, but he hardly seemed to notice where he was. I spent the rest of the day trying to care for him, but he refused to eat or drink, just kept staring out the window toward the trees. His breathing was shallow, his hands still gripping that mix of dirt and stones, his fingers white from holding on so tightly. As night fell again, the feeling of unease returned, stronger this time. I stayed close to him, but he didn't respond, didn't say a word, just kept staring out into the dark, a haunted look on his face, like he'd left something of himself out there. Just as dawn started breaking again, he looked at me, really looked at me like he was finally seeing me after hours. His lips parted, and he seemed like he was going to say something, but no words came out. He just closed his eyes and sank back, his breath slowing until it stopped completely. I stayed there with him until the sun fully rose, casting light over the trees. There was a weight in the air, a sense that something from those woods had reached out and taken him, left him empty. I don't know what he saw out there or what had drawn him away, but something had gripped him so tightly he couldn't break free. And as I finally stepped outside, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Right at the edge of the clearing, where he had been standing, I saw dozens of small stones and bits of dirt scattered in a rough line, like he'd marked his way back. It was as if he had tried to leave a trail, but each piece was in a strange, almost claw-like shape, as if something else had laid it out for him. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us out there, waiting, and I'll never forget how he looked in those last moments, like he'd finally found peace, but was still trapped, like a part of him had been pulled back into the woods, taken by whatever he'd seen in the dark. I had signed up to help a team studying venomous snakes deep in the forest. Our cabin was a small, beat-up place that we rented, far from any trails or signs of people, just a spot to keep our supplies, sleep, and write notes on our work. Every day we'd head out into the thick trees, look for snakes, collect samples, and write down what we saw. Being around some of the most dangerous creatures on Earth made my skin crawl, but I was there to learn, and I kept telling myself that as long as I was careful, I'd be okay. One day, the lead researcher, Dr. Henson, wanted us to go even farther out, to a new spot where people had reported seeing snakes. The forest seemed especially thick and dark that day, like the trees had closed in, blocking most of the light. I kept my flashlight ready, taking slow, careful steps, scanning every inch of ground and every shadow for signs of a snake. Hours passed, and I didn't see anything but leaves, shadows, and the flicker of tree branches. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves were the only things that kept me from feeling completely alone. I was just about to turn back, feeling the heavy quiet of the forest, when I finally saw one. A large black viper coiled up by a rock. I went through the steps I'd been trained to follow, staying calm, moving slowly, and collecting a sample of venom with all the care I could. I was as precise as possible, and the snake just stared at me, still and silent, almost as if it understood what I was doing. I carefully backed away, feeling pretty confident, until I slipped on some wet moss. I nearly fell but managed to steady myself, though not before my leg brushed up against something warm and solid. My heart froze, and I looked down to see another snake sliding over my boot. I hadn't seen it, hadn't even thought to check for anything close by. It was smaller than the viper I'd just worked with, but I knew it was dangerous by the bright patterns on its scales. I held my breath, staying completely still as the snake slid over my boot, then paused, curling briefly around my ankle. My chest was tight as I watched it slowly uncurl and slip back into the leaves. When it was gone, I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling as I realized just how close I'd come. I started making my way back to the cabin, every sound in the forest suddenly feeling louder, every shadow seeming like it might hide something deadly. By the time I reached the cabin, sweat was running down my back, but I was unharmed. I tried to brush it off as a close call, just a reminder of the risks we faced out there. But that night, as I lay on the narrow cot, I felt a strange itching in my leg. At first, I thought it was just nerves, my mind playing tricks, but then the itching grew, spreading into a painful throbbing. I rolled up my pant leg, and there it was, 2 tiny puncture marks, nearly invisible but unmistakable. The snake must have bitten me when I brushed up against it. I just hadn't felt it until now. I bolted upright, my heart racing. We had antivenom in the cabin, but each vial was carefully labeled for specific snakes. If I used the wrong one, I could make things worse. My mind raced, trying to remember the species I'd seen and what kind of venom it had. I stumbled to the supply closet, sorting through bottles and notes, but the labels started blurring as I tried to focus. The pain in my leg was spreading, a fiery ache crawling up toward my thigh. Time felt like it was stretching, like I was moving in slow motion as I searched through the supplies. The dim light in the cabin threw long shadows on the walls, and I could feel numbness creeping up my leg. Finally, I found the vial I thought was right and injected myself, praying it would work. But as minutes ticked by, nothing changed. My breathing became shallow, and I realized that I might have made a mistake. The night dragged on in a haze of pain and fear, and by the time the first light of dawn broke, I could barely move. I lay there, cold sweat covering my skin, feeling the venom pulsing through me, knowing that all my training and precautions hadn't been enough. One careless moment in the forest, one slip, and now I was alone, too far for anyone to reach me in time. As I lay there, struggling to breathe, I thought about how easy it was for life to end out here, with no one knowing what happened. I was just another researcher who got lost in the woods, surrounded by the very creatures I'd come to study, their silent, watchful eyes probably somewhere close, waiting. The cabin grew colder, and in those last moments, I realized the forest didn't care who I was or what I was doing. The trees, the snakes, the silence, they were just there, a vast, empty place that could swallow me whole without a trace, and no one would ever know what happened. It was supposed to be a simple work retreat. Dan, my general manager, had arranged for us to go to a cabin far out in the woods. We were working on a big project, and he thought getting away for the weekend would help us clear our heads and focus. The cabin was a few hours from the city, deep in the forest, far from anyone. Dan said it was the perfect spot to work without anything around to distract us. The drive took longer than we expected. The road kept getting narrower, winding through trees that seemed to close in on us. It was late afternoon when we finally arrived. The cabin was smaller than I'd imagined, barely big enough for 2 people, but Dan didn't seem to mind. He joked about roughing it and started unpacking our stuff. As the evening went on, I started feeling strange about the place. Being so far from everything felt different than I'd expected. The quiet of the woods grew heavier as the day faded, and by nightfall it became unsettling. There were no distant cars, no other cabins around, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the old wood of the cabin creaking. Dan and I didn't talk much. We were both focused on work, but I could tell he was feeling it too, that slow, creeping feeling of unease. The first strange thing happened around midnight. We were sitting at the table, both on our laptops, when we heard footsteps outside. They were slow and steady, crunching on gravel and dry leaves. Dan froze, glancing at me, but neither of us moved. The footsteps stopped after a moment, fading into the silence. We tried to shake it off, telling ourselves it was probably just a deer or some animal passing by. But even after we went back to work, the tension in the air stayed. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing noises. Sometimes it sounded like something brushing against the walls. Other times it was a sharp crack, like a branch snapping outside. Each noise yanked me out of a restless, uneasy sleep, my heart beating faster each time. I kept checking my phone, watching the minutes crawl by, hoping the night would end. Around 3 a.m., I heard Dan get up. I thought he was just restless too, but then I heard the front door open. Quietly, I got out of bed and went to the window to look. There was Dan, standing on the porch, staring into the woods. He didn't respond when I whispered to him. He didn't even turn around. He just stood there, looking out into the darkness like he was in some kind of trance. He stayed like that for what felt like an hour, though it must have only been a few minutes. I watched him, my skin prickling with a sense of dread. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside, shutting the door behind him softly. The next morning, I asked him about it, and he just shrugged, saying he didn't remember doing it. He guessed he was sleepwalking, but the way he said it seemed off, like he didn't believe it himself. That whole day, we barely spoke. Our usual easy conversations were replaced by long, awkward silences. As the evening came again, I suggested we head back early, cut the trip short. But Dan refused. He said it would look bad if we left so soon. So we stayed, though neither of us could shake the discomfort that seemed to hang in the air, growing stronger with each passing hour. The second night was worse. Every little sound felt louder, and the silence in between felt heavier, pressing in on me. Sometime in the early hours, I heard breathing soft and steady, just outside the wall by my bed. I lay there, frozen, hardly daring to breathe myself, straining to listen. It was unmistakable, like someone standing right outside, quietly listening. When dawn finally broke, I'd made up my mind to leave. I told Dan, and this time he didn't argue. I think he felt it too, that strange sense that something wasn't right here. We packed quickly, barely speaking, and drove off just as the sun was rising. The drive back was silent. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the trees. The quiet feeling from the cabin stayed with us, heavy and tense, following us all the way back to the city. It's been weeks since that trip, but I can't shake what happened. I still hear those strange sounds when I lie awake at night, especially that soft, steady breathing outside my window. And sometimes, just as I'm drifting off, I picture Dan on that porch again, staring into the darkness with those empty eyes, like something out there had reached into him and taken a part of him he'd never get back. Dan quit his job last week. No warning, no goodbyes, just an email saying he was done. When I tried calling him, I got no answer. I went to his apartment and it was empty. No sign of where he'd gone, no sign that he was ever there. But when I close my eyes, I still see him standing in the dark, staring into something I can't see, and I wonder if he's still out there in those woods, listening to the sounds that only he can hear. I was around 14 when my parents dropped me off at my grandparents' cabin for the weekend. The cabin was old, worn down, and hidden deep in the woods, far from anyone else. My grandmother was always so sweet, smiling warmly and offering me all the attention she could. My grandfather, though, was quiet. He spent most of his time either fixing things around the cabin or sitting on the porch, staring at the trees. The place was peaceful, but too quiet sometimes. I remember how the silence felt like it was pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. It felt strange being in that cabin, surrounded by tall trees, and still feeling like something was watching me. At night, the wind would whistle through the cracks in the walls, but every now and then, I'd hear noises that didn't belong. Soft knocks on the door, footsteps on the porch when no one was out there, and sometimes light tapping on the window. One evening, I decided to go to bed early, hoping the quiet would help me sleep. The wind was louder that night, howling through the trees. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, so soft I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then came the tapping. Light taps on the window, like someone was trying to get my attention. My heart started racing, and I froze, staring at the window, too scared to move. I forced myself out of bed, my feet moving slow as my chest tightened with panic. When I reached the window, the tapping stopped, but something felt off. I looked outside, hoping to see nothing. The porch light only showed darkness beyond it. The trees were swaying with the wind, and there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of wood creaking, like someone was walking around upstairs. I knew the cabin was old, and the floorboards always made noises, but this was different. The creaking was steady, like someone was moving around. My grandparents were in their rooms, so I knew I was alone. I couldn't stop my chest from tightening as I stared up at the ceiling, too scared to move. I knew I couldn't just lie there. I had to check. Quietly, I slid out of bed and crept up the stairs. The stairs creaked under my weight, and each step felt louder than the last. As I reached the top, the creaking stopped. I stood in the dark hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was only one door up there, the one to my grandparents' room. I pushed it open slowly, and the room was empty. The bed was made, the curtains were closed. Everything looked normal. But then I saw it. The small wooden chest in the corner, the one that was always locked, was slightly open. My heart raced as I stared at it. I hadn't touched it. Neither had my grandparents. I walked over to the chest, kneeling down to see inside. There were a few old things, papers, old photos, and a couple of trinkets. But on top of the pile was something new, a small, worn notebook. Its cover was stained with age, like it had been handled too much. I opened it carefully, the pages crackling in my fingers. Inside were drawings, sketches of the cabin, the trees around it, and then a drawing of someone standing outside the window. I felt my stomach drop. These weren't old drawings. They were recent, the kind of recent that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I slammed the notebook shut, fear spreading through me like wildfire. The air in the room felt thick, like something had changed. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it pressing against me. I turned to leave, but then I stopped. In the hallway just outside the room, I saw it, an outline of a figure standing in the dark. Tall, thin, and unmoving. Felt like it was watching me. I stood frozen, my heart racing in my chest. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, too still to be real. I didn't know what to do. Panic surged through me and I ran. I bolted down the stairs, my feet pounding on the wooden floors. I didn't stop until I was in the kitchen, staring at the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. I couldn't explain what had just happened. Who was upstairs? Who had been standing in the hallway? I didn't want to know. I just wanted to leave. When the sun came up, everything seemed normal again. The birds were chirping, the trees looked peaceful in the morning light, and my grandparents were up, acting like nothing had happened. I didn't tell them about the notebook or the figure I saw in the hallway. It all seemed too weird, too impossible to explain. But as I was about to leave, my grandmother pulled me aside. She looked at me with those deep, knowing eyes, her expression almost too calm. "I hope you weren't bothered by anything last night," she said, her voice low, almost too soft. "This place has a way of bringing up things from the past. Things you might not want to remember." I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't want to know. I just nodded, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. It was like she knew something I didn't, something that made my skin crawl, something that made me realize that I wasn't the only one who'd felt the presence in the cabin. Something had been watching me. Something that had been there long before I ever arrived. As I left the cabin and stepped into the sunlight, I thought I saw something move in the trees behind me. Just a shadow. But I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to be. It had been a long drive to the old farm cabin. By the time I pulled up, the sun was almost down, casting long shadows over the empty field. Milo, my cat, jumped out of the car and ran straight for the porch, his tail flicking with excitement. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and Milo, away from the noise and stress of the city. The cabin had been in the family for years, but it had been a while since anyone had stayed there. Dust was everywhere, and the floorboards creaked under every step. Inside, the air smelled old, like wood and something faintly damp. I tried to push away the strange feeling crawling up my back. After all, it was just an old cabin in the woods, nothing to be scared of. I set up for the night, lit a fire in the stove, and sat down on the couch with a book. Milo curled up at my feet, purring softly, his body warm against my legs. The hours passed quietly, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. But then I heard it, a knock. First it was soft, then louder. Knock, 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 came from the back door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, staring at the door. The wind outside was still, and there wasn't a soul in sight for miles. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and walked slowly toward the door, trying to ignore the thumping in my chest. The door was locked. I knew I hadn't imagined it. It was real. Another knock. Knock, knock, knock. Milo suddenly hissed, his fur standing on end. I froze again. He had never acted like this. He darted under the table, his eyes wide and staring. I looked out the windows, but the night outside was dark and quiet. No one was around. The knocking came again. This time, I moved faster, grabbed the door handle, and yanked it open. No one was there, just the empty porch, with the woods stretching out beyond it, dark and still. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, colder now. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. There was nothing, no footprints in the dirt, no sign of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I quickly shut the door and locked it again. Milo stayed hidden, his eyes darting around the room. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wood, made it feel like something was lurking just out of sight. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside again. This time, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. I forced myself to get up and look out the window. The porch was empty, but the scraping kept going. I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. Slowly, I turned and moved toward the front door, looking through the small peephole. A shadow moved outside, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see who or what it was, but I could tell it wasn't the wind. Someone or something was there. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed Milo and shoved him into his carrier. He didn't protest, too scared to even move. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out. I grabbed my bag and keys and rushed toward the front door. The moment I stepped outside, I saw it. There, just at the edge of the woods, was a figure. A person standing completely still, facing the cabin. My heart raced in my chest, but I didn't stop. I ran to the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off down the dirt road without a second thought, not daring to look back. The last thing I wanted was to face whatever or whoever that was in the woods. When I finally reached the main road, my chest tightened, but the tension slowly started to ease. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The road was empty. Still, something didn't feel right. I thought I was safe, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd seen something like that, but I told myself it was just my imagination. But then, I realized that person, standing at the edge of the woods, hadn't moved at all. Not once. They had just been standing there watching the cabin, waiting. And the worst part, I wasn't sure how long they had been there. Had they been watching me the whole time? The strange feeling didn't go away, even after I reached home. I kept checking my locks, checking my windows, as if somehow that person could follow me. That night, the door knocked again. Just 3 soft knocks, like a warning, a reminder that they knew where I was.